also questions being asked today about the role of the United States in the world, issues such as trade, immigration, what function do international organizations, NGOs play, how technology is breaking down barriers between nations, and the changes globalization, that often used term, meaning perhaps that deepening specialization and extension of the division of labor beyond national borders. How globalization is making changes to both individual lives and nation states. These topics were also being debated in the mid-19th century. And this talk and the exhibition will be about how people in the past connected themselves with global events as they do today. And I'll first talk about these sentiments as expressed by Northerners and African Americans, and then consider how white Southerners, who then became Confederates, also talked about things global and their place and ambitions in the world. And then I'll discuss secessionists who sought to broaden support for their proposed new state, deepened, developed these arguments, and finally then consider how the war made changes to these beliefs, but at the same time adhering to the view that the establishment of the Confederacy was an act of global importance. And hopefully the takeaway will be to reevaluate the significance of the Civil War in how it crushed those ambitions. So in the years running up to the war, technology seemed to be creating a new or the existing world. Americans in the 1850s were acutely aware of how new communications technology, in the guise of steamships, steam printing presses, railroads, the telegraph, were narrowing distances, compressing time, and making the world seem smaller. For example, trips across the Atlantic, which took 40 days or more in the 1830s under sail, were down to 11 days by 1860. A speed that enabled or facilitated the mass immigration to the United States from Ireland and Germany in the 1840s and 50s. To the British, long accustomed to being top nation in the world, such changes were taken as a matter of course in their stride. In 1858, the first Atlantic telegraph cable connecting Britain and the United States came into operation. And to celebrate this momentous occasion, on August the 16th, the respective heads of state exchanged messages. Queen Victoria's message was matter-of-fact, even a bit dull. She hoped that the cable will prove an additional link between the two nations, whose friendship is founded upon their common interest and reciprocal esteem. She unwound enough to conclude with her wishes for the prosperity of the United States. I think Americans in general could see in the long term far more potential for themselves from these changes than the British. And this was especially true for the Queen's counterpart, James Old Buck Buchanan, long-term Democrat Party hack, and still both the last Secretary of State and Pennsylvanian to be president. Such sentiments the Queen expressed were not nearly enough for him to mark the occasion. In his reply, Buchanan, the cable was the great commercial enterprise, accomplished by the science, skill, and indomitable energy of our countries. The cable was a triumph, more glorious because far more useful to mankind than ever was one by consequences on the field of battle. He wasn't done yet. May the Atlantic Telegraph, under the blessing of heaven, prove to be a bond of perpetual peace and friendship between kindred nations, and an instrument divine by divine providence to diffuse religion, civilization, liberty, and law throughout the world. Now, it is easy, perhaps, to dismiss this language as bombast and empty rhetoric coming from the lips of a failing president, mired in corruption, dealing with the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision, and an escalating feud over the extension of slavery, with the most powerful Democratic Party politician in the Senate, Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Nevertheless, as the only historian to win the Lincoln Prize 3 times, Alan Guezo says, quote, "You have to rebuild mentally an entire world with all its taken for granted details before you talk about an individual in it." Buchanan envisaged a role for the United States on the world stage as Christian missionary, commercial developer, peace enforcer, political reformer, and lawgiver. However, as Buchanan saw opportunities arising from the New World opening before the United States, others saw responsibilities increasing for Americans. The African-American abolitionist and reformer Frederick Douglass, who had earlier escaped from slavery, declared in Rochester, New York in 1852, "A change has come over the affairs of mankind. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. No abuse, no outrage, whether in taste, sport, or avarice, can now hide itself from the all-pervading light." He meant that the United States could no longer hide its injustices and inconsistencies, principally concerning slavery, from the critical gaze of the wider world. And if these evils at home do not end, African-American journalist Martin Delaney asked attendees at a conference on immigration in Cleveland in 1854, he asked, "Shall we be persuaded that we can live and prosper nowhere but under the authority and power of our North American white oppressors?" No, Delaney answered his own question. And he presented what he saw as legitimate, feasible options for African-American immigration to destinations such as the West Indies, Central and South America, places where Delaney believed African-Americans could achieve an acceptable level of self-government. Remember, they were denied the vote in the North as well. But Delaney added that it was the United States that was the country best, in his words, developed for African Americans to live in, as it was, in his words, designed by Providence to be a, quote, "reserved asylum for the various oppressed people of the earth of all races." Now, the international context is crucial to understand that such sentiment Delaney expressed increased, the sense of global responsibility of the United States increased during these years. In 1848, a series of revolutions had broken out in kingdoms across Europe, bringing with it a promise of republican rule and democratic government to many countries. Yet these all apparently failed, leaving tiny Switzerland and even tiny San Marino, a mighty 23 square miles in size, as the only republics left standing in Europe. Everywhere it seemed aristocrats and autocrats were on the march, and Britain, a constitutional monarchy, had an electorate of 1 in 7 males were allowed to vote. And that was seen as the democratic great power in Europe. And among the immigrants reaching the United States were refugees from these failed revolutions, which heightened the sense of the United States as that reserved asylum, in the words of Martin Delaney. Now, to sum up this Union and African American view of the global mission for the United States is hard. If it means spreading freedom around the world, well, it depended on what freedom meant. Not if, according to that preeminent wordsmith, Abraham Lincoln, freedom meant freedom to take over the world and exclude others from it. Lincoln attacked his soon-to-be presidential opponent, Stephen Douglas, and his Young America movement, because he espoused that meaning of freedom. In 1859, he mocked the senator and movement for, quote, his extensive, pun intended, opinion of himself. In claiming to be the, quote, inventor and owner of the present and the sole hope for the future, whereas, Lincoln continued, the only thing invented by young America, he jeered, was manifest destiny, which he defined as he owns a large part of the world by right of possessing it, and all the rest by right of wanting it and intending to have it. But what did Lincoln want the United States to stand for? On George Washington's birthday, February the 22nd, 1861, the same day, incidentally, as the Confederacy formally came into being in Montgomery, Alabama, President-elect Lincoln was at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And there he spoke of a goal to which maybe Delaney would also subscribe. Quote, something in that declaration giving liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. The journalist covering the event wrote great applause at that line. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weights, Lincoln continued, should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have equal chance. Cheers at that point. Yeah, good. For Lincoln, the US was not a refuge, primarily for those fleeing persecution, but an example to and source of hope for those struggling to achieve self-government around the world. Secession, by ending the Union, would also end that promise. And these sentiments, as you all know, matured by 1863 into the last best hope on earth phrase in the Gettysburg Address. So, the question is, would those, not by any means all, white Southerners who were at that precise moment becoming Confederates come up with their own transcending objective for their new nation? Even before secession, white Southerners had also caught the globalization bug and rapidly became its leading sufferers. Meetings of commercial conventions across the South ceased to be stuffy gatherings of boosters, planters, and merchants, and instead became, by the late 1850s, venues for speechifying by seemingly demented globalists. South Carolina was an especially fertile ground for the production of these individuals. Leonidas Spratt, prominent journalist and political agitator of Charleston, attended the Vicksburg, Mississippi Convention in 1859 and declaimed there in favor of reopening the Atlantic slave trade, and then went into a rant about the South in the world. He looked forward to a time when Britain and France would both have collapsed into bloody revolution, and, quote, when democracy at the North shall hold its carnival, meaning cross-dressing and gender role reversals across the North, quote, when free love, union shall pervade the land, when the sexes shall consort without restraint of marriage, and when youth and maidens, drunk at noonday and half naked, shall reel about the marketplaces, and meanwhile the South will stand secure and erect. Because, he explained, the slave shall be restrained by power and the master by the trusts of superior position, and as a result the South will move on with a measured dignity of power and progress amidst the chaos. Spratt hoped, in other words, that the South would become the asylum for those who wish to escape from world revolution. But a promise of counter-revolution would not be enough. Secessionists, in making the case for a new nation, it was essential for its appeal to the many doubters across the South that it would credibly and positively exceed Lincoln's ambitious claim for the potential of the United States. And I will give 3 examples of the ways secessionists convinced themselves and then try to convince others about their future in a Southern Confederacy, with its rule by King Cotton being the center of world communications, and finally its promise of unfettered expansion. A few weeks before secession, on December 5, 1860, Robert Bunch, British consul in Charleston, received a prominent visitor, the sometime US Senator and owner of the Charleston Mercury newspaper, Barnwell Rhett. As Bunch reported back to the British Foreign Secretary Lord John Russell about the meeting, Rhett, quote, knew that the feeling of the British public was adverse to the system of slavery. But he saw no reason, Rhett continued, why that sentiment should stand in the way of commercial advantages. Britain, Rhett continued, traded largely with Brazil, which was a slave-holding country. And Britain, moreover, was the largest customer of the southern states for the production of slave labor, productions of slave labor. Commerce, i.e. King Cotton, would conquer conscience in Rhett's worldview. But lest you think these ideas were restricted to white South Carolinians, think again. Even sober white Virginians in this city, whether secessionist, unionist, or somehow managing to be both at the same time, got carried away. And statements from 2 once allied, now feuding Democratic politicians of very different backgrounds demonstrate this contagion of globalization. In this instance, how projects to develop infrastructure, then known as much better as internal improvements, would become enterprises with a global impact. In his January the 7th, 1861 address to the States General Assembly, Governor John Letcher, once a storekeeper in Lexington in the Valley, informed the legislatures, I can't say that word, about the state's railroads, which must soon be a part of a network of roads reaching Kansas and fast progressing to the Pacific. As a result, Virginia will be part of a central belt from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and such a circumstance would give the state great leverage because it would possess, quote, the power in or out of the Union of this great interior and exterior trade. Letcher basically hoped to forge a new reformed union around Virginia and other border states, north and south, connected by both railroads and moderation. Meanwhile, in a letter published both in the Richmond Examiner and also in that best-selling Southern periodical DuBose Review, U.S. Senator Robert Hunter, a significant planter with 60 enslaved people in Essex County, deployed similar arguments, but in support of secession. In an independent South, Virginia would become the equivalent of the state of New York in the new nation, complete with versions of the Erie Canal, which would be the James River and Kanawha Canal extended, and the city of New York's equivalent in the Confederacy would be here, the Richmond-Norfolk conurbation. He went on to describe this future mid-Atlantic metropolis, quote, in a separate Southern Confederacy, there will arise in and about the shores of the Chesapeake a great and commanding center of credit and commerce, Hunter romanced, which would enjoy immense and commanding advantages for the interchange of commerce and the distribution to the world over a vast area, filled with rich and profitable customers. New York, perhaps even London, would be surpassed here in the city around us. The new Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, meanwhile, hoped for a win-win scenario with the North through mutual territorial expansion. On March 1, he wrote to a Northern correspondent, Anna Ella Carroll, who had earlier warned him presently that the North will fight for the Union, slavery will perish, and unless you return to the United States, quote, you will be hopelessly gone. That told him. But Davis was having none of this. Such sentiments about union and anti-slavery belonged to the past. Quote, now we have to deal with the present and the future. He admonished her, and that future and present would be about growth. The North, he went on, has wanted Canada, and the South wants Cuba. The expansion of both may have been restrained in the past by the narrow views of each. Now, let them be left freely to grow as separate nations. And as far as the Southern Confederacy was concerned, Davis said in a speech a couple of weeks before, it will expand anyhow. And he added for good measure the West Indies and northern Mexico as well. The Confederate worldview vision was a collective and commercial one, based on production of staple crops by enslaved people. Individual ambitions would be achieved not by owning the fruits of their own labors, as Lincoln believed, but as unequal participants in a mighty great trading power and economy, which would become a growing empire, reaching out to new markets around the world. Believing themselves conservative and full of moral rectitude, leading Confederates considered other nations and peoples to be grasping and greedy. That calculation is a common one, then and now. But for Confederates, it had great significance, as they believed other nations would fall over themselves to do business with them, despite the fact Confederates were also well aware of global anti-slavery sentiment. So, what about the war? the war was transformative. But for Confederates, despite the changes imposed upon them, it still remained, for continuity, their interests and power still remained slavery and King Cotton. And the president explained why. War is temporary, he told the people in January 1863, and peace is permanent. Whatever the disruptions of the war, the future goals would remain the same. Quote, the production of the South in cotton, rice, sugar, and tobacco is what we do, told Congress on April the 29th, 1861, when he also informed them about the state of war existing with the Union. And he added, in case anybody needed reminding, for the development and continuation of which the labor of African slaves was and is indispensable. Moreover, these staple crops were absolutely necessary, quote, for the courts of civilized man. Cotton was more than a way to make money. Its export was seen as a way to bring a convergence of customs and behavior around the world. So-called savages were always described as half-naked in the popular literature of the time. By wearing garments made of southern cotton produced by enslaved people, they would become civilized. And international commercial transactions had a mystic meaning to Confederates. On January the 30th, 1865, Confederate House member Daniel Buchanan of Virginia told his fellow representatives that, quote, commerce has been the great Archimedean lever which has moved the world. The highest hopes and aspirations of all nations have been to possess and control it, because they know that no wealth can be acquired, nor power preserved without it. He also made the economic and social case for what he believed to be the economic and social case for slavery. He saw as the only way to harmonize labor and capital. In a free labor society, he argued, bosses owned capital, but not the workers, and therefore ambition would lead the boss to exploit the workers to build up his capital by cutting workers' wages and extending their hours, etc. Whereas in a slavery-based society, because the boss owned both capital and laborers, Buchanan argued it suited the boss to have both working in harmony. Therefore, by this theory, better work conditions, or amelioration, as pro-slavery theorists called it, would follow for enslaved people, and that would raise their standard of living above workers in a free labor factory. Contentment would lead to social stability and undisturbed production. Now, as well as pseudo-economics, geographical, religious, and racial arguments for slavery also remained to the end. Because of the aforesaid superiority, forms of slavery, Confederates argued, would become the accepted labor relations across the global South. Joseph Addington defined this region in an 1862 pamphlet steeped in pseudo-scientific race theory. Quote, we now say that blacks must inhabit between 30 degrees latitude north and 35 degrees latitude south, he declared. And the choice was, quote, either the black and white must occupy much of the region in question together in relation of servant and master, and so create a garden which supplies many nations, or by blacks alone, in which case the tropics are destined to become, in Addington's words, a gradual wilderness. Commentators endlessly argued that the economies in Mexico and Central America had failed because of the absence of African Americans. They also argued the economies of the West Indies had also failed, for despite the fact these islands were populated by African Americans, they lacked white masters since emancipation. To Confederates, the two exceptions in the tropical Western Hemisphere proved the rule. Brazil and Cuba thrived in Confederates' view because they had African American slavery along with white masters. Only geography, or as they would say, nature or God, would prescribe any limits on slavery. In the tropical regions of the Western Hemisphere, it would be what Confederates regarded as true slavery, to be expanded under their own auspices, whereas to the other tropical regions across Africa, South Asia, and Australia, the colonial powers, France and especially Britain, would run similar labor systems to extract resources using people from both China and the Indian subcontinent, as well as from Africa. And the immigration flows of the future would be these involuntary and controlled movements of unfree labor between centers of population and centers of production around the world. The fundamental pro-slavery racial argument was that the only way for races to coexist in one country was not in equality, but by hierarchy. And this theory was then deployed by Confederates to reveal hypocrisy in opponents while affirming both morality and a global mission for themselves. Former diplomat William Buchanan in 1864 wrote of Northern abolitionists, quote, "radical reformers all, acknowledging no compensating reciprocity of interest anywhere between the two races, i.e. blacks and whites. Their only motto is, die blacks, live whites." The South's motto, Buchanan continued, would be, quote, "let us live and work together." The choice was clear for African Americans: to face a future of either death in free labor conditions or natural population growth as enslaved people in an expanding Confederacy. So when the then Confederate Senator, Hunter then, told a crowd of 10,000 at the African Church in Richmond on February the 9th, 1865, quote, "we shall solve the problem of the extension of the Anglo-Saxon race to the countries south of us and show that white and black races may be extended together," he meant whites could not exploit the labor performed by African Americans. And in turn, African Americans could not survive without the alleged protection of white masters. What would Confederates do with the power conveyed by commerce and enabled by slavery? And this is my final part of the talk. Back in September 1861, when Hunter was Confederate Secretary of State, he gave some further explication to this topic. He saw no irony that the Confederacy, born in the midst of war, would become afterwards the guarantor of world peace. "It is manifest," he told the new commissioners to Europe, that, quote, "from the nature of its interests, that the Southern Confederacy, in entering as a new member in the family of nations, would exercise not a disturbing, but a harmonizing influence on human society. For it would not only desire peace itself, but would to some extent become a bond of peace amongst others." Now that bond would be the flowing of trade between nations. But technology, some of it hastened by the war, would provide a physical meaning to these bonds. In February 1862, some of the planters in the Mississippi Valley gathered at a convention in Memphis, Tennessee. Quote, the rapid increase of war steamers, they reported, the present number and length of railroads, the long lines of telegraphs are giving to the affairs of the world an accelerated motion. More will be accomplished in human affairs during the next century than has been in the past 500 years. It is time, they declared, for the enlightened states and nations of the earth should cease political persecutions and war for the purpose of keeping each other down. They meant globalization, in other words, by bringing nations together, would lead to slavery being accepted. The exact opposite to Frederick Douglass's earlier calculation. For the slaveholders argued the prosperity of our thorough, amiable relations adds to the welfare of others, meaning slavery's success at home would benefit nations abroad. And a few months later, in May 1862, discussion at another wartime planters convention, this time down in Georgia, showed how communications were also being used and a sort of technology that we have already been talking about. The 300-pound Georgian planter politician heavyweight, Hal Cobb, who had once been Old Buck's Treasury Secretary, told his fellow slaveholders, quote, there is not now, nor will there probably soon be, in the commercial world so interesting a question as, guess what, the laying of a telegraph cable across the Atlantic. The cable that has so excited Buchanan into ecstasies a few years earlier had promptly snapped, and talk of replacements, perhaps following a different route from crossing the North Atlantic, were discussed immediately. Cobb reminded the planters that no less an authority than Matthew Morey had written to him just before the war, quote, you will be gratified to learn that you are not alone in your opinion as to your route. The idea was broached, pending the famous Atlantic telegraph, that the best route would be from England south to Spain and Portugal, south to Madeira, south to the Cape Verde Islands, then across to Brazil, via the West Indies, via Cuba to Florida and the Confederacy, the southern world. And at the same time as the cotton planters met in convention, a diplomat thousands of miles away in Europe was excited by the same project. Dudley Mann, commissioner in Brussels, wrote to the then Secretary of State Judah Benjamin that preparations were underway and, quote, a company is an embryo for the accomplishment of the object. This South transatlantic telegraph was, quote, regarded by scientific men as practicable, and it is estimated that $1 million will perfect the undertaking. Mann concluded the cable is a timely and well-matured policy to make the Confederate States a great telegraphic and traffic highway between the Old World and the West Indies, Mexico, Central and South America, and the ports of the South Seas, wherever they might be. The traffic highway is a confederacy, which would be a transcontinental empire with access to the Pacific Ocean. While in May 1862, while Cobb and Mann were getting excited about telegraph cables, the leading Houston, Texas newspaper, the Weekly Telegraph, welcomed the news that as part of General Henry Sibley's expedition to New Mexico and Arizona to secure those places for the Confederacy, he also sent a mission under Colonel James Riley to treat with the governor of the northwestern Mexican province of Sonora on the Gulf of California. Riley, the paper reported, had got agreement for the right of transit and the free use of the port of Guaymas. The paper explained why this mattered. It opens to us the markets of the whole Pacific coast and the eastern world. From Guaymas to San Antonio is the only feasible railroad route from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. Remember, as an aside, that the first transcontinental railroad was not to be built until 1869. Guaymas, the paper continued, is the best port on the Pacific coast, south of San Francisco, and it's the most central and accessible of all, and will in future years be, guess what, the metropolis of the whole coast. If Confederates do not secure a route to this port, the paper added, then it's finished. US troops and their Native American allies will not only deny both the trade and the railroad to Confederates, but, quote, would also be able to confine slavery within a boundary that would shut us out of 3/4 of the undeveloped territory of the continent adapted to slavery. And finally, the paper concluded, it will be utterly impossible for us to grab those parts of Mexico as changes occur there and as our needs change as well. These rich states of Mexico, so necessary to our future development. Mexico, for Confederates, was the land of opportunity, especially as it was being opened up by technology. The Confederate propaganda newspaper in London, published in London, the Index, editorialized on March 17, 1864, about, quote, the full importance of the American Revolution, of which the regeneration of Mexico is both necessary but also incidental. In the past 40 years, steam, electricity, mechanization have realized miracles of swiftness, accuracy, saving of labor and of time. A 100-fold increasing of man's power to develop the resources of the soil. Mexico is like the enchanted palace of the fairy tale. She awaits but the touch of a wand, magic wand, to spring again into life and prosperous activity. What may we expect from a future aided by the appliances of modern civilization? Schemes of colonization from 1863 proliferated, whether by Southern sympathizers from California or Confederates accompanied by enslaved people. They looked to Mexico and also other places in Central and South America, and these will continue after the war. And particularly the schemes for Sonora and Baja California connected to Confederate ambitions for the Pacific Ocean and the China trade. China, that imagined limitless market for cotton in the future. And Dujanet reminded his colleagues in Congress about, quote, the controlling influence that the trade of Asia has exerted upon the wealth and prosperity of nations in every era of world's history. The fates of Britain, the United States, and now the Confederacy pointed to the wonderful future that is marked out for the western coast of this continent. Under the guiding hands of Providence, the efforts and struggles of nations are but links in the mysterious chain of the manifest destiny of the human race that caused the poet to say, to the west, the star of empire takes its way, where he mangled the title of Emanuel Lutz's 1861 mural in the Capitol at Washington, westward the course of empire takes its way. Remember, Confederates had no monopoly on westward expansion. But in contrast to the focus on the individual pioneer, embraced by the painter and enacted by Lincoln's Republican administration with his independent farmer vision as legislated in the Homestead Act of 1862, the Confederate vision remained collective and imperial. Quote, when we look upon the future of the continent, Dujanet declared, our mental gaze fastens upon the sublime spectacle of an empire that shall arise upon the slope of the Pacific, surpassing in grandeur the most opulent nation whereof history has preserved a record. Finally, the Virginian concluded, the time to start work on this empire is now, in wartime, as, quote, it is part of the wise legislation of our country to see that the language of this great empire shall be our language, that its principles shall be our principles, and its history shall be the history we are making today. A rousing call for an empire based on racial slavery, faith in the power of commerce, and territorial expansion, and one that helped sustain the war effort. But in the end, it was unable to compete with Lincoln's promise of individual fulfillment, which appealed not only to most white Northerners and many white Southerners, but also to the aspirations of African Americans, and so contributed decisively to Confederate defeat. Thank you for listening.
We're going to take a quick 5-minute break. If you want to get another biscuit or see a man about a horse, be back here in 5 minutes for questions with Adrian.